The night Evelyn Moore vanished, the sea took more than a life. It took Thomas Avery's reason to dream again. The townsfolk said the storm that night was the worst Harper's Rest had ever seen. But Thomas knew better. He felt it coming for days. The strange stillness in the gulls, the air heavy with unspoken warning, the scent of salt that clung to the shore like grief waiting to happen. When her boat disappeared beneath those black waters, something in him sank with it, deeper than the tide could ever reach. For 20 years he kept the lighthouse burning, though no ship had reason to pass. And every night, when the waves crashed against the rocks below, he swore he could hear Evelyn's laughter carried in the wind, faint, fractured, and impossibly near. The ocean was never silent along the Maine coast, not even in its gentlest moods. It hummed like a creature that refused to sleep, waves slapping against the rocks, wind sighing through the salt-bleached grass. At the edge of that restless world stood the Wickham Point Lighthouse, whitewashed and stubborn, a single eye watching the gray horizon. And inside its narrow spine of iron stairs and stone walls lived Thomas Avery, the keeper. Every evening, as the sun bled behind the water, Thomas wound the lamp. His hands, weather-cut and careful, moved with the steadiness of someone long married to routine. He did not hum or whistle. Instead, he listened to the slow breath of the sea, waiting for the moment when the lens caught the dying light and threw it back out into the dusk. The villagers of Harper's Rest rarely saw him except from afar. They knew his outline: tall, shoulders bent slightly forward, coat flapping like a tattered sail. Children called him Old Light, though he was not yet 50. He was simply a man whose life had narrowed to a beam of revolving light, a kettle always on the stove, and the memory of a woman whose laughter no longer echoed across the cliffs. Her name had been Evelyn Moore, and she had once loved him. It was in the summer of 1978, nearly 20 years earlier, that she first came to Harper's Rest. The town was a postcard then, lobster traps stacked along the wharf, gulls stealing bait from buckets, tourists trailing sand through the single diner. Evelyn had arrived with a canvas satchel and a notebook of sketches. She painted the sea as though it might run out of color if she didn't catch it in time. Thomas, newly appointed as assistant keeper, had watched her from the hill on his supply runs, trying to decide whether she belonged to the sea or the sky. The memory came to him often now, on long winter nights when the foghorn moaned like a lonely heart. He would sit beside the window of the keeper's cottage and picture her hair blown across her face, the charcoal smudges on her fingers, the way she once said, "If the ocean could love someone, it would love you, Thomas." But the ocean had taken her instead. No one in Harper's Rest spoke of that storm anymore, the one that came without warning, turning August sunlight into bruised darkness. Evelyn had been on the ferry to Camden for an art exhibition, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The vessel never made it to shore. Some said lightning struck her, others that she was seen clinging to driftwood until the waves swallowed her. The Coast Guard searched 3 days and found only pieces of hull and a single boot. After that, Thomas stopped leaving the point. He wrote to her parents once, a short letter promising he would keep the light burning every night in case she finds her way home. It was a promise made not to comfort them, but to bind himself. Years passed. The Coast Guard automated most lighthouses along the coast, but Wickham Point remained too remote for modernization. The town petitioned to replace Thomas with an electric beacon, yet he refused to leave. "When I go," he said quietly, "the light goes." So they let him stay, partly out of pity, partly out of respect for a grief that seemed too large to argue with. He kept a journal, pages filled with weather notes and tides, but also entries written to her. "The tide was high tonight, Evie. I thought I saw your scarf tangled in the kelp again. Foolish, maybe, but I keep looking. The first-person entries had thinned over the years, yet the routine never faltered. Every dusk he polished the lens, trimmed the wick, checked the kerosene, and whispered her name before striking the match. The villagers sometimes visited in late summer when the roads were clear. They'd bring bread or canned peaches, ask about the storms, and watch him with the cautious sympathy one gives to someone balanced on the edge of two worlds. Children were warned not to ask about the lady who drowned. Among them was Clara Henderson, a schoolteacher newly arrived from Boston. She was in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a stubborn belief that loneliness could be cured by good company. She often climbed the hill to deliver letters and talk about the students she taught. Thomas listened politely but rarely answered more than a few words. Yet one evening, as she turned to leave, he said, "Do you know what a promise is worth, Miss Henderson?" She paused. "Depends on who's keeping it, I suppose." He nodded. "Then it's worth everything." From that day on, she began leaving small notes by his gate, weather reports, bits of poetry, or sometimes just the words, "Light still shining?" He never replied, but each morning the note would be gone, replaced by a fresh one she'd find the next day. Still shining. Outside, autumn crept in quietly. The gulls grew fat, and the sea turned the color of old pewter. Storm warnings hummed on the radio, and fishermen tied their boats tighter to the docks. Thomas wound the lamp a little earlier each evening. The sound of the mechanism, metal clicking into place, felt like a heartbeat he could control when so much else had failed him. One night, as he trimmed the wick, a photograph slipped from his journal. It was Evelyn at 24, sitting on a rock with the wind in her hair, laughing at something behind the camera. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb and whispered, "Still shining, Evie, still keeping it." Outside, thunder murmured over the water like a warning. The storm warnings came 3 days early that year. On the radio, a clipped voice repeated advisories for the eastern seaboard. Low pressure, strong winds, possible surges. But Thomas barely listened. He knew the sea's moods better than any broadcast. The gulls were restless again, wheeling low over the surf, and the horizon carried a strange tint, greenish-gray like metal under bruised skin. He spent the morning checking the lantern, trimming the wick twice, then pacing the gallery deck until the boards creaked beneath his boots. He should have felt fear, perhaps. Storms had taken better men. But instead there was something close to anticipation, as though the wind itself were drawing breath before speaking her name. By afternoon, the town had begun its usual preparations. Fishing boats hauled inland, windows boarded, the harbor master pacing with a clipboard he didn't need. Clara arrived around dusk, scarf flapping like a pennant, holding a thermos of chowder wrapped in a towel. "I heard the broadcast," she said. "They're saying this one might be rough." Thomas gave a quiet nod. "They always say that. You could come down to town for the night. The church has. I weathered worse here." Clara sighed. "It's not the walls I'm worried about." He met her eyes then, really looked at her for the first time in months. She had that unguarded expression of someone who still believed in people, something he'd forgotten how to do. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hands trembling slightly as she held out the thermos. "I know you think you're honoring her," she said softly, "but maybe she wouldn't have wanted you to spend your life waiting for ghosts." He took the chowder and turned back toward the sea. "A promise is a kind of grave," he said. "You don't walk away from it just because the flowers died." Clara didn't reply. She simply set a folded note on the railing and left without another word. When the fog closed around the tower that night, Thomas found her note. It was written in her neat looping script. Sometimes the dead forgive us long before we forgive ourselves. He folded it into his journal beside Evelyn's photograph and went about his duties. But the words refused to leave him. The storm arrived the next evening. By nightfall, the sea had risen high enough to swallow the rocks below. Wind howled through the iron railings, and the tower shuddered like a living thing. Thomas climbed the stairs to the lantern room, lantern glass rattling in its frame, flame bending sideways in the draught. Outside, the ocean was a sheet of moving blackness. Waves smashed against the cliff with a violence that felt personal. The light sliced through rain and darkness, cutting a cone of gold that vanished into the storm. Thomas steadied the lens and whispered, "Still shining, Evie, still keeping it." And then, just beyond the reach of the beam, he saw it. A flash of color, blue, like the coat she had worn that summer on the rocks. He blinked, leaning closer to the glass. The wind howled louder, and the image was gone, but his pulse thundered in his ears. Another wave crashed, throwing salt against the window, and he could have sworn he heard her voice. "Thomas!" He froze. The word was clear as daylight, carried through the gale. He stumbled down the stairwell, boots striking stone, and burst out into the storm. The rain hit him in hard, slanted sheets, the air alive with spray and thunder. Below, on the narrow ledge near the waterline, a figure moved, a woman's silhouette against the churning sea. "Evelyn," he shouted, the sound ripped away by the wind. The figure turned toward him. For a heartbeat, he saw her face, pale, hair plastered against her cheek, eyes bright as the lighthouse beam itself. Then lightning tore across the sky, and she was gone. By dawn, the storm had broken. The sea lay bruised and quiet, foam trailing along the rocks like lace. Thomas climbed the hill in silence, every bone aching. The air smelled of iron and rain. At the foot of the tower, half buried in sand, he found something small and waterlogged, a blue ribbon, tangled around a splinter of driftwood. He picked it up with shaking hands. It was identical to the ribbon Evelyn had worn in her hair the last day he saw her. Clara came the next afternoon, her boots leaving careful prints in the mud. "I saw the light from town," she said. "Half the village thought you'd gone with the roof. Are you saying—" Thomas held up the ribbon. "She was here." Clara's brow furrowed. "Thomas." "I saw her," he said, voice trembling. "Last night, on the rocks. She called my name." "People see things in storms," she said gently. "Memories, reflections. It wasn't a memory." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Maybe it was something else. Maybe she's trying to tell you it's time to let go." He turned back toward sea. "If she wanted me to stop, she wouldn't have come back." That night, he wrote again in his journal. The sea took her. The sea brought her back. The light must not fail. He set the journal down, trimmed the wick, and let the flame steady itself in the lens. The glass glowed gold, warm and alive. Beyond it, the waves rolled like the slow beating of a heart. Thomas pressed his palm against the window and whispered into the night, "Still shining, Evie. Still keeping it." Outside, far below the cliff, something shimmered briefly under the water, like fabric drifting in the current, or the ghost of a promise refusing to fade. The wind changed again on the fourth night. It came from the northeast this time, raw, cold, and sharp enough to make the shutters rattle like bones. Thomas knew it before the barometer dropped. He could smell it in the salt, feel it in the ache behind his ribs. Storms had a language of their own, and this one was whispering something old. He tried to work, wound the clock in the keeper's quarters, mended the railing near the stairs. polished the brass fittings on the lantern, but his hands wouldn't steady. His reflection in the glass looked older than before. The ribbon lay on the desk beside the journal, still damp, still blue, though the sea salt had begun to fade its color. Each time he looked at it, a heaviness gathered in his chest. He remembered her laughter that day, the way Evelyn had stood on the cliff edge with the wind tugging her hair loose, shouting something he couldn't hear over the crash of waves. He'd pretended annoyance, shouted back that she'd fall if she didn't move away from the edge. She'd only smiled, lifted her hand and said, "Then catch me, Thomas Avery. You always said you would." That was 20 years ago, and still he hadn't caught her. Clara came again before sunset. The path to the tower was slick with rain, and the sea below groaned like some half-sleeping creature. She brought bread this time, though Thomas hadn't eaten the last meal she'd left. "I shouldn't have come," she said, half to herself. But the harbor master said the wind's turning violent again. "It's early for another storm." Yes, that's what frightens them. Thomas poured her tea from the kettle he never cleaned. She watched him carefully, her expression divided between affection and pity. "You've been seeing her again, haven't you?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "I told you, I don't mean just in dreams." Thomas's hand trembled. The spoon clattered against the cup. "She's trying to reach me," he said finally. "There's something unfinished. You wouldn't understand." Clara's eyes softened. "I understand loneliness more than you think." He looked at her then, really looked. The years had drawn gentle lines around her eyes, but her gaze was kind, steady. There was something living about her presence that unsettled him more than any ghost could. For a long time, neither spoke. The sea murmured below. When Clara finally rose to leave, she touched his shoulder. "If she loved you as much as you believe," she said, "then maybe keeping the light was never the promise. Maybe it was learning to live again." The words struck him like a blow, not because they were cruel, but because they felt true. The night he could not sleep. The fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing the horizon whole. The beam from the lantern spun in slow, golden arcs through the mist, illuminating nothing but air. Thomas sat at the desk, staring at the journal, Evelyn's photograph propped against the lamp. He whispered to it, "What do you want from me?" The silence answered. Then, faintly, so faintly he thought he'd imagined it, he heard her voice again. "Keep the light burning, one last time." He froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. The voice had come from the stairwell. He rose slowly, lantern in hand. The air grew colder as he climbed toward the lantern room. The sound of the waves echoed in the tower's hollow heart, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like breathing. At the top, the great Fresnel lens turned endlessly, throwing ribbons of light into the mist. And there, just beyond the glass, stood Evelyn. Her dress was pale, almost translucent, drifting like smoke in the draft. Her hair clung damp to her face, and the blue ribbon shimmered faintly in her hair. She smiled the way she had all those years ago, tender, unafraid. "Evelyn, Thomas." Her voice was calm, impossibly clear over the storm that had begun to rise again below them. "You kept your promise," she said. "You kept it longer than I ever asked you to." He stepped closer to the glass. "You left me here. You can't come back just to leave again." "I never left," she said softly. "You did. You've been standing in the shadow of what we were." The wind screamed through the vents, shaking the lantern housing. The flame inside flickered. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his throat tightening. "The night you drowned." She placed a hand against the glass, though it left no mark. "The sea didn't take me because you failed, Thomas. It took me because time was cruel." because the world moves forward, whether love is ready or not. The light dimmed for a moment. The ribbon in his hand fluttered as though pulled by some unseen tide. "You don't have to keep it burning anymore," she whispered. But Thomas couldn't hear the rest. Lightning split the sky, and in that instant, the power surged through the tower, too bright, too sudden. The lamp exploded in a burst of flame and shattered glass. Thomas fell back, shielding his face. Smoke filled the room, the sound of the storm deafening. Through it, he heard her once more, urgent now. "Thomas, please let it go." The words tore through him. Let it go. The light, the grief. The promise that had kept him breathing when he should have broken. He staggered to his feet. Flames crawled along the oil-soaked rags near the wall. The wind roared through the open door. He reached for the control valve, but the heat drove him back. The lens cracked, splintering light across the smoke like 1,000 eyes. Below, the sea raged against the rocks. He could have fled. He could have saved himself. Instead, Thomas stepped forward, through the fire. Through the blinding light, his gaze locked on the figure beyond the smoke. "Evelyn," he whispered. She smiled. "You already caught me." The floor gave way beneath his feet, and the lighthouse, keeper, lantern and all, became a single column of gold against the black of the storm. When the villagers came the next morning, the tower was still standing. The storm had passed, leaving the coast in eerie calm. The lantern room was charred, its glass shattered. But the light, miraculously, had burned through the night. The keepers found no trace of Thomas Avery, only a single blue ribbon, caught in the railing, fluttering in the breeze. And below it, in the sand, a fresh carving in the wood. The promise is kept. The sea was calm the morning after the storm, unnaturally so, as if ashamed of its own violence. The villagers of Harbor's Rest stood along the bluffs, faces pale and silent, watching the smoke rise from where the Wickham Point lighthouse had once stood proud. Only the foundation remained, a ring of scorched stone and twisted metal clinging to the edge of the cliff. By noon, the Coast Guard arrived. The men combed through the rubble, calling Thomas Avery's name into the wind. Though most knew it was only for formality, they found fragments, the brass compass from his desk, a half-burned logbook, a boot tangled in seaweed. Later, as the tide receded, one of them spotted something glinting among the rocks, a small locket, salt-stained but intact. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman sitting on a rock, laughing. Evelyn Moore. Clara Henderson stood a few steps away, clutching her coat against the bitter wind. She had arrived before dawn, guided by a gut-deep dread that twisted tighter with each mile from the village. The path up the hill was littered with debris, pieces of lantern glass, wood, seaweed, like breadcrumbs leading her to a truth she wasn't ready to face. She saw the men recover the locket and felt her throat close. She didn't cry at first. There was only a hollow ringing in her ears, the same sound she'd heard the night before when she'd seen the beam flicker wildly through the storm. One final, desperate pulse of light before it vanished. By afternoon, the sky cleared. The sun broke through the clouds, casting the coastline in fragile gold. Clara stood alone by the ruins until the others left, then knelt and placed something small in the sand. One of the folded notes she used to leave by his gate. On it, she had written 2 words, "Still shining." The tide crept close enough to wet the corner of the paper, but she didn't move. She whispered to the wind, "You kept your promise, Thomas. Even now you kept it." In the days that followed, the town was quiet in a way that felt wrong. The harbor, usually bustling with fishermen, lay still. The diner served coffee without laughter. Even the gulls seemed to circle lower, as if searching for something lost. The townsfolk didn't speak of Thomas much, but when they did, it was with the reverence reserved for ghosts and saints. The Coast Guard's report called it the tragic accident due to electrical failure during extreme weather conditions. But those who knew Thomas, truly knew him, believed otherwise. They said he'd seen the storm coming, that he could have sought shelter, but chose to stay, chose to light the lamp. One evening, about a week later, Clara walked to the cliffs again. She brought a lantern, small, brass, the kind children used for fishing nights. The wind was gentle, the ocean glassy. She placed the lantern on the ground, lit the wick, and watched the flame tremble. It wasn't the great Fresnel light that once crowned Wickham Point, but it was something. A faint, flickering promise against the dark. She stayed until the flame burned out, whispering stories to the sea. Stories of him, of Evelyn, of promises made and kept. That winter, the town raised funds to rebuild a memorial where the lighthouse once stood. It wasn't grand, just a stone column with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Thomas Avery, Keeper of the Light, lost to the sea, 1998. Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Still shining." The phrase puzzled some, but not those who had known Clara. She'd asked for it personally, saying only, it was what he used to say. After the dedication, she moved back to Boston, but locals claimed she returned every year on the anniversary of the storm. Always alone, always at dusk, carrying a single lantern. Children who grew up in Harbor's Rest told stories about those nights. They said if you stood by the cliffs when the fog rolled in, you could see two lights, one faint on the water, one higher, pulsing from the ruins. And if the wind was right, you could hear laughter, faint, fractured, impossibly near. Clara never confirmed the stories, but she never denied them either. In her small apartment in Boston, she kept a weather journal on her nightstand. Thomas's old logbook, the one salvaged from the wreckage, she'd read it sometimes when the city grew too loud, tracing the lines of his handwriting. One page was different from the rest. The ink had run in places, but the words were still legible. If the ocean could love someone, it would love you, Evie. And if love can be a light, then I will keep it burning, even if it takes the last of me. She closed the book, touched the brass locket she now wore around her neck, and whispered to the quiet, "Still shining." The following spring, a new lighthouse was built at Wickham Point, automated, steel, efficient. It lacked the old charm, but the beam was bright, visible for miles. On the first night it lit, the villagers gathered on the docks, watching the white arc sweep across the water. Clara stood apart from the crowd. The beam turned, reached the cliff's edge, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw a silhouette, tall, steady, coat flapping in the wind, facing the sea. Then the light moved on, and the shape was gone. The new keeperless light burned on. But to those who lived in Harbor's Rest, the old one never really went out. Years passed. The town of Harbor's Rest changed, as all towns must. The old bait shop became a cafe. The wharf, once cluttered with lobster traps, now hosted tourists who came for the view, not the work. The Wickham Point Lighthouse, rebuilt in cold steel, shone dutifully every night, its beam mechanical, its soul gone. But stories have longer lives than structures, and along the Maine coast, stories cling like salt to the air. Children still spoke of the old keeper's light, the one that appeared when the fog rolled thickest, faint but alive, as though Wickham Point remembered. One summer evening, nearly 15 years after the storm, a journalist from Portland arrived in town. She was writing a feature on haunted harbors of New England. And Harbor's Rest, with its lonely cliffs and weathered locals, seemed perfect for her list. At the diner, she found Clara Henderson, older now, gray streaking her hair, her posture still upright but gentler around the edges. She was visiting for the week, sitting in her usual corner with a mug of tea and a book open but unread. "Excuse me," the journalist said, notebook in hand. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the old lighthouse keeper, would you? Thomas Avery?" Clara smiled faintly. "Wouldn't happen to know? My dear, no one ever stops knowing him." She gestured for the journalist to sit. Outside, the sky burned orange over the sea, and the new lighthouse flashed in slow intervals, a steady, artificial rhythm. Clara spoke softly, as though afraid the sea might overhear. She told her about Thomas and Evelyn, about the promise he made, about that final storm. She described the old lamp, the sound of the waves battering the cliffs, and the light that refused to die until he did. The journalist scribbled notes, eyes wide. "And you really believe he stayed during the storm?" Clara nodded. "He didn't stay because he wanted to die. He stayed because he promised to keep the light burning for her. It wasn't duty, it was love, the kind that doesn't ask for rescue." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the hiss of the coffee machine and the faint cry of gulls outside. Then the journalist asked, "And the stories, the people who say they still see the light or hear voices?" Clara's gaze drifted to the window, where the horizon was fading into mist. "You ever love someone so much you start seeing them in everything that moves?" she said quietly. "The sea just remembers better than we do." Later that night, Clara returned to the cliffs one last time. She walked the familiar path, slower now, cane tapping against the stones. The new lighthouse beam swept over her face in mechanical pulses, indifferent, cold. She carried a lantern, the same brass one she'd brought the week after Thomas's death. It was tarnished now, handle wrapped in old cloth, glass chipped from years of use. She placed it on the edge of the bluff and lit it. The wind was mild, the sky moonless. The ocean breathed against the rocks below, steady, eternal. Clara looked out over the dark water and whispered, "Still shining, Thomas, still shining." The flame flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw it, a second light, far out on the water, faint and golden, swaying as though someone walked beside it. She closed her eyes and smiled. When morning came, a fisherman found the lantern on the cliff. The wick had burned to ash. Next to it lay a journal page, brittle and water-stained. Only a few words were legible, but they were enough to tell the story. "Love is the only light that never burns out." The fisherman brought it to town, and soon the locals began leaving candles on the cliffs every year on the storm's anniversary. Some said it was superstition, others called it respect. But when the fog rolled in thick and the candles flickered, the villagers swore they could see shapes moving through the mist, a man and a woman, side by side, walking toward the horizon. The ocean hummed softly beneath them, never silent, never still. And somewhere deep within that endless gray, a light kept turning, patient, steadfast, and shining still.